Hi, you guys. It's me, Miss Fry. Okay, how you doing? I liked book clubs today. That was fun. Okay, let's get started. So we left off. What else should we do tomorrow? Oh, they're in London. They're at Claridge's, the big department store, hotel, and Ada is with Mrs. Lady Thornton because Susan is in the hospital. And Lady Thornton asks, "What else shall we do tomorrow?" "It's Susan," I whispered. "Yes, my dear, but besides that." The hospital was a red brick building, tall and thin. Inside it smelled exactly like the hospital where I'd had my surgery. We checked in at a desk by the front door, and a nurse came downstairs to tell us that Susan had had a difficult night. Her fever was still high. They were continuing to treat her with sulfa drugs, and they hoped to see improvement soon. Visiting began at 3 p.m. I studied the walls and the stairs. If I could escape Lady Thornton just for a moment, I could run up those stairs and find Susan. "It's difficult," Lady Thornton said. She took hold of my hand and led me back outside. She wouldn't let go, not even when I tried to pull away. The London near the hotel and the hospital was not a London I had ever seen before. Even with sandbags lining the sidewalks and storefronts, and glass missing from windows and whole chunks of buildings bombed, even in drab winter, this London was prettier and greener than I ever imagined. Stores still had goods in the windows. There were evergreen bushes and sometimes trees. There was grass. "The first thing we should do," Lady Thornton said, "is buy you a new coat." "I don't need a new coat." "Nonsense," she said. When I glared at her, she added, "What do you think Susan would say? Would she want you to have a new coat?" It wasn't fair play. I was still wearing the coat Susan had bought me over a year ago when I was in hospital. It had been small for me then, and even though Susan had altered it repeatedly, it was hopelessly tight on me now. We'd not been able to find a coat my size for sale in the village, used or new, and we'd not been able to go elsewhere. Susan would love me to have a new coat. We went to a place called a department store. Did I read this? No. I didn't read this, did I? No. Okay, sorry. We went to a place called a department store. It was huge, a city of shops under one roof. In the children's section, a woman measured me and brought out 4 different coats for me to choose from, all well made of good new wool. One by one, I tried them on. "Very suitable," Lady Thornton said, nodding. "Which do you prefer?" Red, navy, gray, and a sort of brownish green were my choices. "I don't know," I said. Lady Thornton said, "I'm not choosing for you. It's your coat. I want you to like it." Susan said I looked washed out and red. I reached toward the gray coat. "Good," Lady Thornton said. "We'll take it." Lady Thornton told the store clerk I would wear the new coat now. She gave her my old one and asked that it be delivered to Claridge's. The woman said, "Very good, ma'am," with a sort of mushed-up voice. I looked away when Lady Thornton paid for the coat. I didn't want to know how much it cost. Less than my surgery, but still. Next, we took a bus to a huge building Lady Thornton called a museum. She did not explain what a museum was. "They've taken the paintings away for safekeeping," she said, "but now they have concerts here every weekday at lunch." We joined a long, slow-moving queue. Inside, we found seats among rows of little chairs. Lady Thornton bought us each a sandwich from a table at one side. Eventually, a woman came out to play the piano at the front of the room. Lady Thornton told me it was called a piano. I'd not seen one before, though it looked similar to the organ at church. Its music wasn't quavery like church music. I've never heard that word before, quavery. It wasn't like any music I knew. It was all sounds running together without words, and somehow, quaver. Maybe I've heard that word before, but not quavery. Have you heard that word before? Quavery? Anyway, if I shut my eyes, it reminded me of good things, of summer and happiness and grass. It was the sort of music I could disappear into, so I let myself disappear. I could breathe. I almost fell asleep. Afterward, Lady Thornton seemed more relaxed, too. "I do love concerts," she said. Concert, piano, hotel, lift, department store, museum. I wish I had my dictionary. "Has Maggie ever come here and done all this?" I asked. Well, not these particular concerts, Lady Thornton said. These are special because of the war. I mean, stores and Claridge's and all the bright buildings. Lady Thornton laughed. Of course. It was a completely different world before the war. Margaret and I used to come up for weekends. I took her to pantomimes, the zoo, all sorts of things. We had grand adventures. Lady Thornton's whole face smiled, remembering. Even her eyes looked happy. We walked back to the hospital through streets damaged by bombs. Some buildings had been partially repaired. Others lay in broken, twisted heaps. We both stopped to stare at a pile of rubble sandwiched between two stores open for business as usual. I suppose there's been no time to clear things, Lady Thornton said. At the hospital, inside the door, up the steps and down a long hall, white walls bisected by a dark wooden rail, a wooden door, a room full of beds, unfamiliar faces, until we reached the very end, the last bed on the left, and there was Susan. I ran the last 2 steps but stopped before I touched her. Was I allowed to touch her? She was sleeping, her head and shoulders lifted high on a pile of white cased pillows. Lady Thornton said, Susan, Ada's here. Her eyelids fluttered. They slowly opened. Susan smiled. A noise came out of me that was half a laugh and half a cry. You can sit down, Lady Thornton said. You won't hurt her. Very carefully, I sat on the edge of Susan's bed. I moved myself a tiny bit closer, and then I let my head and shoulders lean forward until I was just touching her side. I would have hugged her the way Jamie did, but I didn't want to make it harder for her to breathe. I had to bring her, Lady Thornton said. She was fretting herself sick. Susan lightly touched my hair. Of course, she whispered. I needed to take care of Susan. She was sick. I was strong. I was her ward. But Lady Thornton was already unpacking the things of Susan's that she'd brought. Lady Thornton combed Susan's hair for her and filled her water pitcher while I just lay beside Susan, letting her stroke my hair. I'm not going to die, Susan said. Lady Thornton and I both froze. Don't worry, Susan said. They say I haven't turned the corner yet, but I think I have. I'm not going to die on you, Ada. Becky, I said. Yes, I know. She spoke slowly with pauses in between each word while she breathed. But now they have a new kind of medicine, sulfa. Didn't have it when Becky was sick. It's a wonderful drug, Lady Thornton said, in the hearty voice she used to encourage the WVS. It's working, Susan whispered. Ada, I won't die. I didn't entirely believe her, but I believed her a little bit. Chapter 55. When it was time to leave, I kissed Susan's cheek. It was still too hot from fever. When we walked away, I felt like I was abandoning her. I felt like I was being abandoned. She's getting good care, Lady Thornton said. She grabbed my hand to make me walk faster. I should be taking care of her, I said. Don't be ridiculous. Lady Thornton started, then, to my surprise, her voice softened. We would both do all we could, she said, but we are not trained doctors or nurses. She needed to be in a hospital. There's no need to be ridiculous. We walked several blocks in silence. After all, Lady Thornton said, Susan herself couldn't repair your foot. You needed a surgeon for that. The next morning, Lady Thornton took me to the zoo. It was huge, spread out like a farm with lots of buildings, and every building housed different kinds of animals. There were sandbag huts and bomb damage and a Red Cross building, but most of the zoo was like London, carrying on despite the war. Here's the monkey house, Lady Thornton said. Monkeys had faces almost like people. They swung on ropes and screeched. Some were little, but others called chimpanzees were bigger than I was. I stared and stared. Jamie would have loved them. Zebras looked like striped ponies. Lions looked like huge versions of Bovril. Ostriches looked like nothing I'd ever seen. It was hard to believe they were actually birds. Penguins, they were birds too. Elephants, camels, giraffes, a hippopotamus. I'd never imagined animals could look like this. I wish Jamie were here, I said. He would be ecstatic. We'll find a time to bring him, Lady Thornton said. I hadn't realized the zoo was open during the war until I inquired at the hotel. The reptile house was closed. Had to put the poisonous snakes down, one of the keepers told us, in case there was a bombing and they escaped. Move the rest of them to the country. Pity, Lady Thornton said. I particularly wanted to show Ada the dragon. Dragon? You said dragons were imaginary. Certainly, Lady Thornton said. The ones in stories are. But there's a largish type of lizard called a Komodo dragon. Margaret always found him fascinating. You simply could not trust anything anyone ever said. He doesn't fly, Lady Thornton said, nor breathe fire. He's not that interesting. What about angels? I said. Lady Thornton raised her eyebrows. What about them? Are they here too? If the zoo could have dragons, why not? Lady Thornton said, Not that I've noticed. I would have questioned her further, but suddenly she smiled. Oh, the duck pond, she said. We should have brought bread for the ducks. When Margaret was small, it was her favorite thing. She pointed to the edge of a small pond surrounding a few tiny islands. I remember her standing just there in her little russet coat, surrounded by ducks and laughing. Lady Thornton's voice was softer than usual. She had curly hair when she was small. Curly hair and the most adorable little hat. Adorable? I had never heard Lady Thornton use such a word. We love the zoo, Lady Thornton said. Susan didn't get better, but she didn't get worse. Every day Lady Thornton and I woke, went to the hospital for news about Susan, walked around the middle of London, then went back to the hospital for visiting hours. Lady Thornton walked me past Buckingham Palace, where the king lived. It had been bombed, but not badly. She showed me the Tower of London and the House of Parliament and Westminster Abbey, which was like a church, but with all the tombstones inside. She showed me a whole heap of buildings that were important to her, but not to me. I didn't find any of them as interesting in the zoo. Plus, Susan wasn't better. It was so hard to pay attention to anything besides Susan. One day, Lady Thornton and I struggled through heaps of rubble and half-closed, battered streets to get to an enormous church called St. Paul's. It stood mostly unharmed amid blocks of destruction. Lady Thornton set out a long breath when she saw it. A miracle, she said. What would London do without St. Paul's? I was in London once and I went to the top of St. Paul's and I got sick. It was too high and we went around like in a thing and but it is beautiful. Oh my God, it's such a gorgeous place. I didn't mind looking at buildings. We had to do something before visiting hours, but they didn't hold my attention. I found myself mostly noticing small things, like the holes in concrete curbs where iron park railings had been torn out to be made into bullets and guns, or a silver barrage balloon with one cable loose that bobbed and dipped in the wind, or Wren on a street sign. When I wrote to Jamie on the fancy hotel stationery, I told him about the little things, not the big ones. On our 5th day in London, Lady Thornton walked me down a curved street with grand white buildings lining both sides. This is where I grew up, she said, pointing to a doorway. 3rd floor, 4th window from the end, watched over by a nanny and then a governess. I looked up at the window. The house was all fancy, but the window. You were locked up? I said. You only have the one window? Oh, Lady Thornton shook her head. I got taken out on proper walks twice a day. I usually saw my parents for an hour after tea. Not entirely locked up then, not quite the same. Still, can you imagine? Sometimes I went to parties and children's teas, but I didn't have any real friends, not until I was nearly grown, Lady Thornton said. It's partly why I insisted Margaret go to boarding school. I never wanted her to be lonely like I was. I stared at the window, 3rd floor, like mine. Lady Thornton and I had things in common after all. Susan's fever broke. When we came into her room that afternoon, she could lift her head from her pillows. She leaned forward and she smiled with her whole face, and she put her arms around me. I put my arms around her. I clung to her, and I cried. I cried like I might never stop. All the tears I hadn't cried for a whole week came out in one long flood. Tears and snot drenched Susan's nightgown. I didn't care, neither did Susan. I love you, I whispered. Oh, she said it. I buried my head against Susan's shoulder. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you before. Don't be sorry, she whispered back. I know you love me. You know I love you, too. On our way out of the hospital, Lady Thornton took my hand and pulled me to a stop. Now that she's better, we'll be leaving London soon, she said. It'll take her a few more weeks to recover completely, but you and I have work at home. I nodded. I miss Jamie and Butter and Fred. So I have a favor to ask you. I've shown you my London. Will you show me yours? I looked up at her, puzzled. Will you show me where you grew up? Lady Thornton asked. Will you show me where you lived? I didn't want to. I never wanted to go back there myself, let alone with Lady Thornton. But she'd brought me to Susan. I couldn't say no. Okay, I'm going to stop. Don't yell. She said she loved her. Yay! That's so nice. I knew it was coming. I hoped it was coming. Okay, that's it. I'll see you tomorrow and for morning meeting, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.